Welcome. This is the How to Play overview video for the board game Wizard's Loot. Wizard's Loot is a 1 to 4 player board game about exploring dungeons, slaying monsters, and hoarding loot. Your team's goal is to escape the perils of the dungeon with your lives by working together to defeat enemies, collect their essences, and slay the dungeon depths boss. Once the boss has been vanquished, the adventurer with the most loot is the winner, unless you choose to dive deeper into the depths of the dungeon. Players take turns leading the group and exploring the dungeon as the active player. Wizard's Loot is a game about exploration and choices. The game will reward or punish you for the risks you take. Choose wisely. Your collective decisions will determine if all of you make it out alive with bags full of loot, or if your corpses are added to the ever-growing pile in the wizard's dungeon. The winner is the player with the most loot at the end of the game. But remember, you need each other to survive, so sometimes you might need to trade or even use your loot to make it out alive together. Setup. Place all of the cards and tokens within reach of the players as shown here. Then, each player chooses an adventurer to play. There are 3 adventurer types: Standard, Elite, and Legendary. Refer to the table in the rulebook for the player count and selectable adventurer types for your current game. Adventurers all have unique stats and skills, so be sure to read all of them to understand their capabilities better. HP is the number of heart tokens that you add to the group's heart pool for this adventure. Melee power is the number that you add to any successful melee ability this adventurer performs during combat. Item slots are the total number of items that this adventurer can have equipped at any time. Weapon slots are the total number of weapons this adventurer can have equipped at any time. Note, all items and weapons will indicate the number of equipped slots that they require on them. Ability draw is the number of ability cards this adventurer can draw during their combat turn. Action points are the number of actions that this adventurer can take on their combat turn. Starts with are the cards that this adventurer starts with at the beginning of the game. Skill is a unique skill that this adventurer can perform when applicable. Some of these skills can occur during combat only when triggered, while others can be performed outside of combat for a cost. Reputation and rumors are some extra flavor text about your adventurer. Once all players have selected their adventurers, each player draws the adventurer starts with cards. These are usually equipment and/or loot cards, but some adventurers start with specific equipment, so refer to the starts with section of your adventure card. After equipping, trading, using, or shoving the equipment and loot into your loot pile, each player may draw a single adventurer trait and a single creature contract. Traits are optional additions to your adventure that can be good or bad, so make sure you're feeling lucky if you draw from this deck. Creature contracts are optional conditions that your adventurer can complete during their time in the wizard's dungeon. If the creature contract is completed and the adventurers survive, the adventurer gets additional gold at the end of the game. The next step is to populate the combined heart pool of the adventuring party. Count up each adventurer's HP and combine the total tokens into the heart pool. When damage is taken or healed, it is to the group's collective heart pool, so your group lives and dies together. Make sure you watch each other's backs down there. You are now ready to start playing Wizard's Loot. Choose an active player, and they start the group's turn from the top of the room faces. Explore, search, fight, loot and trade, and event. Explore. The active player chooses either an easy or hard exploration tile. Easy tiles have fewer chances of enemies, but also fewer chances of rewards. Hard tiles have a higher chance of enemies and a higher chance of rewards. The active player chooses one, flips it over, and places it against another exploration tile with a connecting hallway. Look at the top of the newly turned over exploration tile for the icons. Draw these cards and place them face down below the exploration tile. Search. The active player may choose to roll the search die once in the newly explored tile. The search die is another way to add loot and equipment to the newly turned over tile. Be careful though, your additional searching might cause extra monsters to show up. Add any cards indicated from the search die face down below the exploration tile. If there were monsters and/or minions drawn during either the explore or search phases, then the adventurers must fight these enemies in the combat phase. Turn the enemy cards over, populate their individual HP with the enemy HP tokens above them, and place their spoils underneath them. HP and spoils are indicated on the enemy card. Note, enemy HP is separate for each enemy, so you have to target them individually. The combat phase is made up of combat rounds. Each round consists of individual combat turns for each player, and then the enemies attack the group. Once every player and the enemies have had their combat turns and the combat round is over, if enemies are still alive, then another round of combat begins. If there are no more enemies, then the combat phase ends. Combat is where each player acts on behalf of their own adventurer. The active player does not control all adventurers for combat. Starting with the active player, they draw their total amount of ability cards indicated by their adventurer ability draw stat from any combination of the ability card decks: melee, magic, or defend. Once the active player's ability cards have been drawn, they can take any one of the following actions for each of their action points. 1. Select their targets and choose an ability card to attempt. Unless it states otherwise, discard the ability card after it has been attempted. 2. Use an equipment's ability. Using an equipment card during combat costs 1 action point, unless stated otherwise on the card. In the event that there are no actions a player can or would want to take, they can pass their combat turn. After the active player has exhausted their action points and have discarded any unused ability cards, play continues clockwise to the next player. This repeats until each player has used their adventurer's action points on their combat turn for that combat round. Anytime a player kills an enemy, reduces the enemy HP to 0 or below, they immediately take any spoils from under the enemy and place them face down next to their adventurer to sort during the loot and trade phase. Adventurers cannot trade equipment or loot during combat. Players also move the slain enemy card to their respective essence piles. Defeated foes become essences and count towards your loot total at the end of the game. Monster essences are also required to open the boss tile on each dungeon depth, so keep track of those across all of the adventurers. Now the enemies get a combat turn. Any enemies that are still alive deal damage to the adventurer group's HP. Total the enemy attack damage and subtract it from the group's health pool. When subtracting enemy damage, make sure to account for any adventurer's defensive equipment or any successful abilities that negate incoming damage for that combat round. If all enemies have been killed, the victorious adventurers move on to the loot and trade phase. All bonuses awarded from any successful ability cards clear at the end of the combat phase. If the adventurer's combined HP is reduced to 0 or below, the game is over and the players lose. Loot and trade. During this phase, all adventurers turn over their newly acquired loot and equipment cards. The active player flips over any loot and equipment cards that were drawn into the room during the explore and search phases and places them next to their adventurer. All players can equip, use, trade, deconstruct, or resolve loot and equipment cards. There are no hard and fast rules about trading. Be as cordial or cunning as your temperament dictates, but be mindful of your adventurer's equipment slots. If an adventurer cannot equip any more items or weapons because their slots are full, the player must either trade with other players or deconstruct the equipment into loot. Deconstructing equipment cannot be undone. Once deconstructed, equipment cards can only be used as loot. Loot and deconstructed equipment are turned face down and placed into the player's loot pile, where it becomes currency for playing certain adventurers' skills or for tallying at the end of the game. Everything in the loot pile serves an actionable purpose in the game, so hoard as much as you can. Event. When the loot and trade phase has ended and everyone has stowed away their treasures, the active player may choose to draw a single event card. Event cards are notoriously unpredictable, and each event brings with it yet another round of risk and reward. A lucky draw might result in more loot or a healing spell, but an unlucky one might destroy some of your equipment or initiate another round of combat. After the event has been fully resolved, players may once again equip, use, trade, deconstruct, or resolve any equipment and loot gathered from this phase. Active player status then rotates clockwise to the next player and the room phases are repeated. If the active player decides to skip the event phase, their turn is over and the next clockwise player assumes active player status and the room phases are repeated. Escaping the dungeon. Collect monster essences, kill the dungeon depth boss, and make it out alive with all of your loot. Simple as that. Once the minimum amount of monster essences for that dungeon depth have been collected, the party may choose to fight a dungeon depth boss. To fight a boss, the next active player reveals the boss tile during their explore phase and proceeds immediately to boss combat. If the dungeon depth's maximum amount of monster essences have been collected, the boss finds you and initiates combat at the start of the next active player's explore phase. This means that once the adventurers collect the maximum amount of monster essences, the next active player must reveal the boss tile during their explore phase and proceed immediately to boss combat. Boss combat rules are the same as normal combat. Like lesser enemies, bosses have active or passive skills and spoils that must be considered before combat begins. Once the boss and any additional enemies have been slain, the players then proceed to the loot and trade phase as usual, after which they will need to decide whether they dive deeper into the dungeon or escape with whatever loot they've managed to hoard. Scoring. Each player totals the value of their loot, equipped items and weapons, enemy essences, boss essences, and any successful creature contracts. All gold amounts can be found on the individual cards. The player with the highest total wins. Thank you for listening to this How to Play overview of Wizards Loot. Please follow us on social media for more information about our development process and early access to playtesting the game if interested. Take care.